Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Kent and Edward both sent me this story from Fox News, and this is an amazing case. Federal judge rules that a 156-year-old ban on at-home distilling is unconstitutional. You don't often see laws on the books for that length of time before they're tested. So it makes you wonder why it got this far. But the Texas judge ruled that a ban from 1868 exceeds Congress's power to tax and violates the U.S. Constitution. So this is happening in a federal court in Texas. Landon Meehan wrote this for Fox, and the judge, in his ruling, sided with Hobby Distillers Association lawyers that the 156-year-old ban exceeded Congress's taxing power and violated the Commerce Clause. Now, there is a clause in the Constitution that says Congress has the right and the power to regulate interstate commerce. And the question is, they've sometimes regulated things that don't appear to be that interstate. And so, is at-home distilling, that is, you're making moonshine in your basement, is that interstate commerce? Really? The Hobby Distillers Association is a group that advocates legalizing a person's production of spirits for their own personal consumption. And the quote here is, "Indeed, the Constitution is written to prevent social amnesia of the defined limits it places on the government of and by the people. That is where the judiciary must declare when its co-equal branches overstep their constitutional authority. Congress has done so here." And the amazing part, of course, he's saying they did it here 156 years ago. And better late than never, I guess. The judge issued a permanent injunction prohibiting the U.S. government from enforcing the ban against members of the Hobby Distillers Association. The judge also stayed his decision for 14 days to allow the government time to seek a stay at the appellate court level. So I got asked about this recently. When a federal judge in some district in Texas declares an entire law unconstitutional, what happens? Well, the government, as you can imagine, can appeal this. And they can file a direct appeal to the Court of Appeals, but they could also seek a stay on enforcement of this and then get that from the Court of Appeals, theoretically, because apparently the judge here is saying, I won't grant it. But if you want to go above my head, go right ahead. So we'll see what happens there. It was the case that violating the at-home ban could make you face $10,000 in fines or 5 years in prison. A lawyer for the Texas-based hobby group at the libertarian think tank Competitive Enterprise Institute told Reuters that the ruling respects the rights of our clients to live under a government of limited powers. The hobby group, which represents the plaintiffs and 4 of its members, filed a lawsuit in December against the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau and the Department of Justice, saying that the government's regulatory reach could not extend to activities within a person's home. The Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau is a division of the Department of Treasury that regulates and collects taxes on alcohol, while the Department of Justice is who prosecutes felonies. And of course, they could have called this a felony before and prosecuted you for it. The decision is a victory for personal freedoms and for federalism, says the lawyer for the Competitive Enterprise Institute. We're pleased to see that the court determined that the home distilling ban is unconstitutional, that it blocked enforcement of the ban against our clients. More broadly, the court's decision reminds us that as Americans, we live under a government of limited powers. The judge said that while there are 3 individuals who failed to prove that they faced a credible threat of prosecution, the group and one of its members had carried the burden of showing that they would be harmed if the ban was not blocked. And the reason is that this one person received an unsolicited letter from the alcohol and tobacco tax people. So he's sitting there and he gets this letter and it says, by the way, you might be in trouble. And he faced potential civil and criminal liability after the organization from the government, had learned that he may have purchased materials that could be used to distill spirits. And right there is the thing that's going to cause a lot of people to go, wait a second. How did they know that he purchased materials that could be used to distill spirits? And we've always been leery of this, because what happens is they might not know what you're doing at first, but they might track down somebody who's selling stuff. Depends on what the stuff is. And then they go, okay, who'd you sell it to? And then they come knock on your door and say, oh, did you buy one of these things? What are you doing with it? And I can tell you that years ago, you used to be able to go online and also in the backs of magazines and find places that sold devices that would allow you to receive encrypted broadcast entertainment. And you get this device and you would install it and you would be able to watch stuff that you couldn't normally watch without paying for it. And so the companies that were losing money theoretically to people who were not paying for their stuff but were simply, pirating it, they would get the government involved, cracking down on the people selling these devices. And then if you bought one of these devices, you get a letter saying, we understand you bought this device. But the interesting thing was it was not the government cracking down. It was the people who ran the business and their attorneys. So apparently this guy got the letter from Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, and Trade Bureau that said he faced potential liability, both civil and criminal, meaning we can sue you or we can prosecute you. So the Department of Justice claims the ban was a valid measure created by Congress to protect the substantial revenue that the government raises from taxing distilled spirits by limiting where plants can be located that distill spirits. Now, I'll admit to you that up until that portion of the story, I was actually thinking to myself, I know what they're going to argue. It's not what they argued. They apparently said, we're going to lose tax revenue. We created a law, and it generates revenue. Therefore, what? See, believe it or not, if you are distilling spirits and you do it wrong, you can actually create dangerous stuff. And by dangerous stuff, I mean people can get hurt. So if you were to distill the stuff wrong and then sell it or give it to somebody else and they got hurt, the government's going to step in and go, okay, we need to stop these people who are making this stuff that's hurting people. But instead, the Department of Justice claims the ban was a valid measure to protect the substantial revenue the government raises from taxing distilled spirits. So they're apparently saying, and attempting with a straight face to say, that we want to tax the stuff that you drink. And if you make it at home, we can't tax it anymore. Do you tax Starbucks when they hand a coffee to somebody? Does that person who's buying that coffee, do they pay a tax? Does Starbucks collect a tax? So at-home coffee makers are cutting into the taxes. Maybe we should outlaw that too. The judge said the ban was not a valid practice of Congress's taxing power because it did not raise revenue and did nothing more than statutorily ferment a crime. Ferment a crime. While prohibiting the possession of an at-home still meant to distill beverage alcohol might be convenient to protect tax revenue on spirits, it is not sufficiently clear corollary to the positive power of laying and collecting taxes. Because what they're saying is, the judge is saying here, is that by saying we're going to tax this, they've taxed it out of existence. And is that really what taxes are intended to do? They might do that, but are they intended to do that? The judge said the ban on at-home distilling could also not be covered under Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. He said the ban is not a comprehensive scheme of regulation because there are many aspects of the alcohol industry that Congress has left untouched. While the federal government has become more enthusiastic about inflating the scope of its powers over the last century, this case shows that there are limits to the government's authority, says a lawyer for the hobby group here. If the government appeals this decision to a higher court, we look forward to illuminating those limits. It's an interesting case. It's possible that the government could appeal this, and the Court of Appeals could spin it around, and there you go. But it's an interesting point, and more interesting to me is that this law was passed in 1868, long time ago, 1868. I barely remember it. And you often hear about laws where Congress passes a law, there's a lot of brouhaha in Washington, a lot of people upset around the country. The law gets passed because the president signs it, and it becomes law. And then you hear about somebody who's filed a lawsuit, and the lawsuit works its way through the courts, and a couple years down the road, it makes its way to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court either says yay or nay. And that's the traditional path we think of with laws being attacked like that. Here a law, again, in 1868, 156 years ago, that everyone knows about. And of course, think about the moonshiners and the people with their stills up in the foothills, and all this stuff. And the revenuers are coming. The revenuers are coming. And of course, this is what we think about. Now, I do understand that a lot of the other stuff came up because of Prohibition. But the crazy part is that Prohibition was both passed and then repealed, the Volstead Act, during this time. And you wonder about, the fact that this law predates all of that. And somebody came along and said, I don't think that's actually right. And like I said, I'm amazed that the primary argument that they appear to have focused on is the ability of Congress to pass taxes. And again, they might have thought, well, gee, we've been doing taxes for so long and to such a dizzying degree. maybe the court will buy that. I would have thought, no, it's a safety issue. Because what if they start selling unsafe spirits that start hurting people? That'd be an issue. And, so it's a wild case. It's a wild case. I'm sure it'll go up on appeal on some level, and I will continue to follow it. We'll see what happens. But Kent and Edward both, thanks for sending it from Fox News, and Landon Meehan wrote that. Federal judge rules that 156-year-old ban on at-home distilling is unconstitutional because a judge says that ban exceeded Congress's taxing power, but also was a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. Questions or comments, put them below this. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. But I don't want to go outside. There's people out there.